Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon.
I'm Stuart.
We're both property people running our own businesses. This podcast is just us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. This week, we're going to start with a freehold offer. And this is an offer that has been made to Stuart. But it's not, as you might expect, a normal purchase offer, is it? What's your story here?
Well, it's the studio flat that we own, which we are, touch wood, in the midst of selling for the third time. And we've now had an offer from the freeholder to say that they want to sell the freehold. So we have a lease on the property, and they are now selling the freehold to the existing tenants, I believe, of which there are 6 of us, or 6 leaseholders. And I suppose in normal times that would be good news, wouldn't it? That you can take a piece of your property and not have to worry about it. But we actually spent a few years ago just over £20,000 to extend the lease on aforementioned property. So it's one of those where it's given me mixed feelings, but mostly a feeling of regret and annoyance and frustration.
Yeah, I mean, you can't tell what's going to happen in the future. So you made the right decision at the time. But yes, it's still going to be frustrating. So how has this arisen? Because I think, I could easily be wrong on this because this is definitely not an area of expertise, but I think if a freeholder decides they want to sell their freehold, they have to offer it to the leaseholders first. Mm-hmm. And then if the leaseholders say they don't want it, or if enough of the leaseholders say they don't want it, it can then be sold on the open market. So what has actually happened so far, and what stage are you at?
Well, the stage is that we heard via one of our tenants that one of the neighbouring owners was trying to contact us, and actually we went to the property this week to clean it prior to the next guest, and there was also a letter from the solicitors. So the freehold is being sold for just under 20k. I won't give out specifics, but I mean it's there or thereabouts, and there are 6 owners. So the interesting thing for me was on the letter. So it's a legal letter for the reason that you just mentioned. I think that they have to follow that process. But we are the most recent renewed lease. So, for example, it'll say we have 90 odd years because actually it'll probably be 100 and something because we extended recently. Then there'll be someone else that's got 69 years of their term remaining, and so on. So there's a bit of a mixed bag, and we're the most recent. So my view was with my wife is that I guess the first thing we'd need to understand is how that is weighted, because clearly I wouldn't expect to be paying 1/6 of a price when I've just spent, it was just over £22,000 to extend the lease. So my only thought around it is, do I wrap it into a sale? But quite immediately my thought was no. We've had 2 failed sales. I don't want to complicate this any further than it already needs to be. But be interesting to know if you've heard anything of how that would be weighted. But my sort of very simple view would be that from a legal standpoint, they'd have to work out the terms of each lease remaining and do a calculation, whatever that is, on how that apportions fairly across the leaseholders.
In answer to your question, I have absolutely no idea.
Good.
However, if anyone listening does, please reach out on Twitter. We can be found on Biz of Property. That's BIZ of Property. And both Stuart and I are watching that handle. So you can reach out to Stuart directly there and let him know if you do know the answer.
We may cross your palm with silver. We may not. But please do reach out and let us know.
So this letter that you've received, presumably this is sort of saying, you as a leaseholder and other leaseholders, would you like to buy it? So assuming that's the case, have you spoken to the other leaseholders yet? Because you have to do this collectively, I think, don't you?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. We picked up the letter yesterday, so we have yet to action it. I think there's a timeline on it. I haven't even got round to reading it properly. I would assume that, well, it does have to be the leaseholders, but it could be that, one leaseholder says, fine, I'll have 2 shares rather than 1 share. But the letter is from a solicitor, which I assume is the freeholder's solicitor. And anecdotally, I remember speaking to the freeholder when I was renewing the lease, and he just said he was really fed up with it. And I know we're all going to get our violins out now, but he was fed up with it because service charges and having to chase everyone for payments and this and the other. And again, we're poor but it is a challenge. And equally, my guess, and it is a guess, but my guess would be with everything coming down the pipe in terms of leasehold changes, and I know that's for new builds at the moment, but I'd imagine there's a lot of uncertainty about what leasehold will actually mean in the future. So probably better to sell up and move on now than wait for the government to sort things out for you.
Yeah. So if you and your fellow leaseholders in this block do go ahead and purchase the freehold, you will end up in a share of freehold situation. Mm-hmm. Have you ever been in that situation for anything else you've owned?
Well, I have, Simon. I just sold a property that we owned a quarter of the freehold, and that was a property that we had a few issues with, but we owned a quarter of the freehold. So, and all that meant, as far as I was concerned, was that we just employed the managing agent, as it were, an independent managing agent, to look after the property, stroke communal areas and roof, and had agreements on a fund. And there used to be annual meetings, which happened probably once while I owned the property in 6 years. But
I'm not sure that's quite the definition of annual, but anyway, carrying on.
It was supposed to be annually, but I think it was just each owner was doing their own thing. But yeah, I mean, typically that's what we do. And we did have communication with each other. And, if someone said, I don't know, the external window clean is going to cost £1,000, and we'd all respond and say, I don't think so. Please recost it, that kind of thing. So it definitely makes things easier. And it certainly, from a selling point of view, makes things easier when you're not talking about leasehold. I mean, I think there's a leasehold on it, but it's 1,000 years. And of course, once that expires, as the owner of the freehold, you just agree to do it at a nominal fee. But there's a few things you definitely need to be aware of that I wasn't previously, that you need to make sure there's a managing agent and you're responsible for that. And actually, as part owners, you are all responsible for the upkeep, etc.
So there are only 4 of you in that situation, and from the sounds of it, you had a fairly good situation there, and presumably everyone paid their fees and things like that. The current one that you're looking at, I think you said there's 6 leaseholders in total, so slightly bigger, but not much. But the freeholder, one of the reasons that you said they're setting up is because they're having trouble chasing fees. So would you be worried about going into a share of freehold when perhaps some of your fellow leaseholders are not so good at keeping up with their fee payments?
Well, personally, in this scenario, because I'm selling the property, it's not something I'm even thinking about. I need to see where we get to with the selling of this property. And if it falls through again, which hopefully, obviously it won't, then I'd think about taking it on just to help it. But I think it's along with everything else. If you are the part owners and all of you have agreed with it, then there's a certain level of responsibility. But I think that the issue could arise where you've got everyone else paying service fees and just one not. And I have heard of that before. And I guess it would be like dealing with a bad tenant, is that you have to then follow procedure to make things happen. And I have heard stories about that where you do then have to go a legal route to. And of course, when you're signing these agreements, there are, it's incumbent on you as a share of the freehold to do these things. So I think you just have to follow the due process, if you were unlucky enough for that to happen. And as you say, I think, the odds increase, don't they? If you go from 4 to 6, there's now 6 chances where someone just doesn't pull their weight. But it's an old Victorian property. It's been around for a while. I mean, there is a fair amount of upkeep to be done in terms of the communal areas. It's a nice little place, but I would envisage that the current owners wouldn't be the sort of owners that would kind of not pick up their duties, as it were.
So you mentioned you're selling this flat as well, as you have tried to do a few times before. What stage is that sale at?
So we had a buyer pull out at the end of last year. So we had 2 purchases fall through, and we had a buyer come back in January, and we've kind of said, okay, it's the same buyer that kind of put it on pause for a reason which I won't share on this show. But so they came back and we said, okay, if it happens quickly, we'll do it. they are just waiting to get approval of their mortgage, I believe. So, and once that happens, all of the legals has already been done, barring quite a key piece actually around a deed of variation. But again, without going into all of that again, bottom line is we need to follow up with the estate agents, because I'm kind of at the stage with this one where if it doesn't happen within a certain time frame, i.e. we don't get to exchange within a certain time frame, I will be ending the sale, because we're getting to a stage where, and I'm sure lots of other people can identify with this, where we've got early redemption charges on the property, which we're willing to stomach for now. But of course, as time passes, those redemption charges are reducing. And so it gets to a stage where my wife and I say, okay, do we just hold on to this now? Because it's actually performing very well as a serviced accommodation property and delivering more income. However, obviously, we'd rather have the income out of the property, the equity out of the property to do what we needed to do with.
Cool. Well, good luck with that. I hope it actually manages to get through to exchange and indeed completion.
Yes, thank you. And while we're on updates, one update that we mentioned briefly was that in our previous a couple of podcasts ago, we were talking about rental increases and your hesitance, reticence, your moral empathy with tenants, and about whether or not you could reduce it, and if you were, to what amount. What stage are you at with that?
So I actually obviously looked up all the details and ready in preparation to contact them, and worked out that they've been in the property 6 years without any rental increase during that time. So I did, following our discussion, conclude that I really should increase the rent after 6 years. And that's what I did. I emailed them and explained the situation, and that I needed to look at a small rent increase. And the amount I plumped for was an increase of £75 a month, which is 5.5% of their previous rent. So 5.5% increase over 6 years. I don't think that's too bad. They've obviously been back in touch and confirmed that it's not good news, but they are willing to accept that. So yes, as of next month, their rent will be very slightly increased. And I now feel really terrible.
Particularly when you have to say it on a podcast, because we're evil landlords, and how dare you. But overall, in terms of your engagement with them, how did you feel? It was just an acceptance. It wasn't neither negative nor positive.
Yeah, it was just an acceptance, I think, really. I mean, rents do increase, and they've been living there for 6 years without a rent increase, so I'm sure they must have known that this was going to come at some point. So yeah, I think just, as you say, acceptance.
Oh, it's good. And of course, as we've said, 5.5% in 1 year. If we look at inflation, that's probably there or thereabouts in this last year alone, not including the previous 5 years. So it's not an unfair thing to ask for, and I think that's
No, and it is the rent they will be paying is still approximately £400 below the going market rate for a property in that area. So,
and did you put that information to them as well?
I didn't name numbers, but I did point out that it was still well below market rate.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something you've got in your back pocket, so to speak, if that arose, if there was a real contention against it, you could always say, look, I've looked at this market, and I'm pretty sure reasonable people accept it, but B, they could have a look in the marketplace. And I've seen other people with unscrupulous landlords that have just gone from what current rent was to, in inverted commas, market rate, and it just pushed my friend out of the property she was living in, which is completely unfair. And that landlord wasn't willing to sort of negotiate. So you're approaching this in a very, very different way, in a very fair manner. So,
and I did say in my communications with them, if they ever find they're having trouble paying and things, that they should get in touch with me first. So yeah, hopefully it will all go smoothly. Hopefully it won't be too big a stretch for them, and hopefully it'll all just proceed as normal. But yes, it does worry me, especially as every day we see another headline about the cost of living going up and cost of energy and food and everything else. So I think it's best that we move on from talking about my concerns and worries about increasing rent and what happens when rents can't be paid sometimes is that a tenant will end up in debt and a landlord may have to take drastic action. And unfortunately, I think, Stuart, you're in that situation now.
Yeah, sadly, and as we always say, it's not a situation we want to be in. It's not a situation we take any sort of pleasure in talking about or doing. But every now and again, we have to. And we've recently had to serve a Section 8 notice on a tenant because we've got a tenant that has stopped paying. But for me, the key thing is has stopped communicating. And the tenant in question has always been patchy in terms of communication. And when I say patchy, I think I've only ever had one communication in over a year and a half. And the payments have been sporadic at best, but got to a stage where they are now 3 months in arrears. And once they go 3 months in arrears, as one of the Section 8 clauses states, we, particularly on a room share, we can serve a 2-week possession order. So that doesn't mean that there would necessarily be an intention to take the property back in 2 weeks. And of course, legally, there'll be ramifications. As we're all well aware that we couldn't just walk in 15 days and take that room back. It's not going to happen. But the intention is there. And typically, we serve that just to really just try and get, from my perspective, to try and have that communication, because we've sent several emails. I've tried calling, no response. And once we served it, a payment did come in without communication, and this has happened previously. But it's a stage now where we're still 2 months, or the tenant's still 2 months in arrears. We haven't had any communication about it, and you kind of left as a landlord, property owner, not knowing what else to do. Because even once we'd served the Section 8, my view was, look, we've served this repossession order, which can happen basically after 14 days is up. However, I'd much rather that you and I have a chat about what's currently going on and how we can help, how we can support you if there are these issues. But without anything coming back, you're really left with little option, particularly when it's in a house with several people.
It's a very difficult situation, isn't it? I suspect they've made it extra complicated for you by now paying some rent, so they're no longer 3 months in arrears. So your previous notice is probably no longer valid. So there's all sorts of extra complications there. But what are you planning to do next? Are you going to try and sort of continue with the official eviction route for rent arrears, or are you going to let it slide for now and wait and see what happens with the next payment or any further payment? Or I don't know, is there a third option? Could you talk to any of their housemates to try and sort of create a communication route in that way, or something else?
Yeah, I think we'll get there. I mean, with the Section 8 notice, it's actually 2 months rent arrears. We're able to do what we can do. It's just I wait till 3. And again, just to be clear to those listening, this isn't the first time this has happened. So I wouldn't. This is absolutely the last resort that I would take with a tenant to get things sorted. So yeah, even though that payment's been made, it's still 2 months in arrears as far as we're concerned. They're on a periodic tenancy. Yeah, and like you say, I think the only other option I have is to try and go through other tenants, just to contact him to say, look, what's the plan? What's happening? And I will inevitably visit the property myself, knock on the door, and just to see if I can have a chat. Because once you're in front of people, they're often very different, and you can speak with them. And I think this is one thing, and I know you particularly you are always concerned about is the well-being of the tenant, in terms of if they're in a situation, and we've all been in situations we don't want to be in. And I don't want to exacerbate that situation, but all I can do is what I've done, which is say, look, please talk to us. The rent is due. If you're having difficulties, please please call me on this number below and let's have a chat. And I word it that way to make it feel less onerous, less legal. But then once that's not been responded to, you're kind of left with very few places to go. And often, and particularly in a shared house, these tenants tend to have other traits as well, which I'm not going to get into on this particular podcast. But let's just say that probably not always the most inclusive and connected people or engaging people to be around.
Yep, it's a difficult situation to navigate. As you say, when there's no communication channel, it just gets even harder. I think you had I'm not sure if it's a tenant leave or went through the eviction process a little while ago, and you had some outstanding debt still hanging back from that or hanging over from that. Have you followed up with that or decided to write that off, or where are you sitting with that these days?
Yeah, so I haven't written it off yet, and I'm always somewhere in the middle on this because, speaking candidly, I've got better things to do with my life than chase up, let's say, several £100 for the sake of argument, which it's around 1,000. But the key for this particular one was it was always the principle of the issue, which is, once again, the tenant left without communicating, without going into those details again, but they didn't leave the flat in a great way. However, by the time we've taken the deposit and everything else, the number that they owed had probably halved, but there's still several £100s there, and we still had to pay for a lot of cleaning, random items that were left in the gardens and so on, a smashed front door and so on. And I think it's the principle of someone believing that they can just leave that behind and then become uncontactable. And I don't want to pressure people or make them feel worse in situations. But then equally, I do believe that, there is a responsibility in life that we have to have. And personally, I have been through some of these situations myself where the act of having to face up to and take responsibility is what helped me grow. And try not to sound, condescending in any way around that. But that's why I haven't quite let it go. And so to answer your question, I have got the debt collection agency on the case. I actually got the forward address from a separate company, a debt tracing agency. So we got the forwarding address, and I have debt collectors sort of ready to go. And I don't, and I'm probably just reticent to push the button because it will apply pressure to this person. But then equally, I'm thinking, well, they probably should know that even if it's only several £100 to £1,000, that it's not the sort of thing you can just walk away from as an adult. Indeed.
The people you've involved already to help you with this, what does that cost you? Presumably, they either want money up front or they're expecting a percentage or something of the recovered money. So how is that working?
Yeah, so the debt tracing, I think that was about £25. There's a great company. If you just Google debt tracing, there's a couple of really good ones that if you've got certain information, which I had, around national insurance number and name and obviously previous address, because they'd lived at the address, it kind of came back within, I think, a couple of hours with a forwarding address. So that's one option. And then the other option was hiring an agency that don't want anything up front, but they would take a certain amount from the fee. And again, given that I'm expecting nothing, I thought putting up nothing is probably a better way to go. So that's the option I've gone for.
Do they, when you start talking to them, do they sort of do some pre-screening for them to evaluate whether they think that there's any chance of recovering anything, and hence whether they want to put any effort in, or do they take on everything and just accept that they'll only get a certain hit rate for those?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on this one, we haven't had those sort of open conversations about whether they would or wouldn't. It's they just sent me the forms to sign and it's been agreed. So I assumed, but I would think that they would do that in terms of probabilities and also amounts, because clearly no one's going to waste time on a few £100, because the cost of the admin, the cost of actually making phone calls and doing everything else would negate any of that. So I'd imagine there's a threshold in terms of debt recovery amount and like you say, a probability. But this one, they're happy to go and chase it. So the question is whether I will continue the.
What sort of Sorry, I was going to say, what sort of percentage do they want?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I think they had a sort of a minimum charge of a maybe between 150 and 250 based on the amounts that we were given. So I don't, as a percentage, that probably comes out quite high.
Yeah.
Probably comes out somewhere around 10-15%. But again, as you know as well as I do, that in this scenario, if we're expecting nothing, if we got something, then we're happy to share it. And like I say, for me, this is more around principle, and I'd be happy to hear from other people listening, whether reach out to us at Biz of Property on Twitter or thebusinessofproperty.com. What will you do? I know we talk about this many times in the past, but is it worth teaching someone a lesson, or should we just let it go and move on with our lives? That's I guess it's a moral question as well as a financial one.
Indeed. And perhaps less of a moral or financial question, but we need to move on as well. So I think we're going to bring this episode to a close there. And it just remains for me to say, please do leave us a rating in whatever podcast app you use. We'd really appreciate it if you could just leave us a rating, preferably 5 stars, but anything will do. We don't mind. And you can find show notes for this episode and all of the others on thebusinessofproperty.com. And Stuart and I will talk to you again next week.